They stood shoulder to shoulder in a space too small for one man. Two waist gunners, 50 caliber Brownings in their hands, oxygen masks hissing, frost crawling over leather and steel. A sudden lurch. A shoulder hits a chest. A sling snags. A hose pops free. One man reaches for his oxygen line with mittened hands. The other tries to swing the gun to the beam. Bullets rake past. The slipstream tears at everything. In the scramble, one gun goes silent, then the other. This was not theory. This was life inside a B-17 at 25,000 feet, with the temperature 60 degrees below zero. And on a cold morning in late May of 1943, at RAF Alconbury in England, that reality collided with an experiment. 7 YB-40 gunship variants rolled out for their first combat mission. They were packed with guns and armor. They promised salvation for bomber crews who were dying in the skies over Europe. Instead, they revealed the flaw that had been there from the beginning. Before the war, American air doctrine believed in the self-defending bomber. Instructors at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama taught that tight formations and concentrated fire would make daylight precision bombing possible without escort. The theory looked convincing on a chalkboard. The theory fell apart over occupied Europe. The 8th Air Force began operations in August of 1942. By the winter of 1943, the mathematics were brutal. Operational analysts inside the 8th Air Force estimated that a typical B-17 could expect to survive only a handful of missions before being destroyed. Crews had to fly 25 missions to finish a combat tour. Survival odds for a full tour hovered at a level that commanders called unacceptable. Empty bunks in Nissen huts told the story. So did the crates of personal effects shipped back to American families. Replacement crews arrived faster than they could be trained for combat. German pilots understood the fortress and its blind spots. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 did not attack where the bombers were strong. They attacked from the front, from below, and from the beams, using slashing runs and disciplined coordination. They forced gunners to twist in place, to tangle with their own equipment, to fight the airplane as much as the enemy. The waist was the worst place of all. In the B-17E and the B-17F, the two waist windows were directly opposite each other in a fuselage barely 10 feet wide and narrowing to the tail. Each opening was roughly 2 feet by 3 feet. The gunners stood with little clearance, wearing sheepskin suits, steel helmets, flak vests weighing about 30 pounds, parachute harnesses, and thick gloves over electric liners. 200 miles per hour of slipstream roared through the openings. Ice formed on gun mechanisms. Oxygen regulators froze. A gun jam meant gloves off. Frostbite took fingers in seconds. In training, the waist positions looked manageable. In combat, they became a source of chaos. Gunners bumped elbows. Ammunition belts fouled. Oxygen lines tore free in evasive maneuvers. Combat reports in early 1943 described repeated cases where waist gunners could not engage because they were physically interfering with each other. Over Germany, men died of hypoxia and frostbite, while enemy fighters flashed past unchallenged. The YB-40 program grew out of a desperate interim idea. Long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang were not yet available in numbers. The P-47 Thunderbolt was fast and tough, but it could not reach deep targets and still return home. The solution proposed in 1942 was to turn some bombers into gunships. Lockheed's Vega plant converted standard B-17F airframes into YB-40 gunship escorts. They added a Bendix chin turret under the nose. They mounted a second dorsal turret in the former radio compartment. They replaced single waist guns with twin mounts. They turned the bomb bay into an ammunition magazine carrying more than 10,000 rounds. They bolted on more armor. On paper, the YB-40 looked like a porcupine with engines. In the sky, it struggled. Heavier weight meant sluggish climb and poor acceleration. Once the standard bombers dropped their loads, the YB-40 could not keep up. Even worse, the twin waist guns made the worst space in the airplane smaller still. During training at Alconbury, gunners tripped and tangled in that narrow corridor. On May 29, 1943, 7 YB-40 aircraft joined a raid to Saint-Nazaire. The mission exposed the human factors problem in cruel detail. Gunners in the waist failed to track fighters on the beam. Reports after landing pointed not to courage, but to design. Weeks later, another mission brought tragedy. A YB-40 was lost after its crew could not bring coordinated fire to bear in a beam attack. Investigators realized that this was not bad luck. It was a structural mistake built into the airplane. The aftermath shows how the American system responded when lives were on the line. At Wright Field in Dayton, the Air Technical Service Command gathered the reports, photographs, and gun camera film. In Seattle, Boeing engineers led by Edward Wells studied the geometry of the waist. At Douglas in Tulsa and at Lockheed Vega, modification teams pulled airplanes into hangars and measured. The United Airlines Modification Center in Cheyenne, created to speed combat improvements into the fleet, set up a full-scale mock-up. They brought in experienced gunners. They asked a simple question: how do we keep two men from crashing into each other? The best answers are often simple. Move the windows. Stagger them. Shift the left waist window forward by roughly 3 feet. Shift the right waist window backward by roughly 3 feet. Give each gunner his own box of space. Maintain overlapping arcs of fire without overlapping bodies. Tests in Cheyenne proved the point. Gunners could swing their Brownings without smacking elbows. Ammunition chutes no longer crossed. Oxygen lines stayed connected. Records from the test program show a dramatic drop in interference incidents. But the engineers went further. Open windows brought in deadly cold and violent wind. The Cheyenne team designed enclosed waist windows with plexiglass panels and rotating gun mounts. The result, known in the field as the Cheyenne modification, turned the waist from a hole in the fuselage into a true fighting station. Implementation was fast. Late production B-17F aircraft began receiving staggered waist windows in the summer of 1943. The new B-17G model, rolling down the line by late August, baked the change into the design. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega aligned on the same solution. The B-17G also carried the chin turret as standard. The tail station gained better sight lines. Every significant crash report from early 1943 had been turned into a checklist of fixes. Production numbers tell their own story. Boeing in Seattle built thousands of B-17G aircraft. Douglas at Long Beach built thousands more. Lockheed Vega in Burbank added still more airframes. Every one of those airplanes carried the staggered waist layout, enclosed windows, and improved mounts. It was an industrial demonstration of speed and learning. Engineers fed designs to modification centers. Modification centers fed proof back to factories. Crews saw the results in weeks, not years. The test was combat. Autumn of 1943 saw repeated raids into northern Germany. Crews flying B-17G aircraft reported that waist gunners could finally track fighters cleanly through the beam. Claims of kills are always imperfect measures, but the trend in loss rates under beam attack was clear. On October 14, 1943, the 2nd Schweinfurt raid battered the 8th Air Force. Losses were catastrophic. Yet, When analysts compared the data, the newer G models with staggered waists fared better than older F models still in the line. The improvements did not make a bomber invulnerable. They made a bad situation survivable. German pilots noticed. After-action notes from fighter wings complained that waist gunners now kept steady aim throughout an attack pass. The old tactic of a beam approach at medium range became more hazardous. The Luftwaffe adapted. They fielded standoff rocket mortars firing heavy projectiles from beyond machine gun range. They created heavily armored assault variants with thicker plate and additional weapons built specifically to break bomber formations. When your enemy feels forced to invent new weapons to regain advantage, your last change worked. Training shifted with the hardware. At gunnery schools like Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, instructors changed the syllabus. Staggered stations allowed proper deflection practice. Gunners drilled in calling out ranges, in handing off targets between windows, in keeping oxygen discipline under stress. Armorers learned to route belts and chutes cleanly in the new bays. Mechanics learned to keep the enclosed mounts free of ice. There were also quieter improvements that mattered. Heated suit controls became more reliable. Oxygen regulators were shielded and insulated. Interphone cords were secured to keep them from snagging. Cartridge case catchers kept brass from tumbling underfoot. Each detail was small. Together, they reduced chaos. The strategic impact arrived in the winter of 1943 and the spring of 1944. On January 11th, hundreds of American bombers struck aircraft factories deep in Germany. Losses were still heavy. The majority were older models. The newer G models came home at higher rates. In February, during the week-long offensive known to airmen as Big Week, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force attacked aircraft production across the Reich. Losses were severe, but sustainable. The defensive upgrades on the bombers worked hand in hand with better escort tactics. Lieutenant General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January of 1944. He changed the mission of the escorts. Instead of hugging the bomber boxes, fighters were told to hunt. The P-51 Mustang now had the range to range ahead and around the formations. The P-47 received drop tanks to reach farther. With bombers more able to defend themselves, fighters were free to slash at the Luftwaffe wherever they found it. The combination was decisive. On March 4, 1944, American bombers reached Berlin in daylight. The sky over Germany filled with contrails, explosions, and twisting fighters. Crews in B-17G aircraft reported that their waist guns worked as advertised. Tracking felt natural. Communication was clear. When they returned, loss tallies showed improvement over earlier deep raids. By June 6, 1944, the day Allied armies stormed Normandy, the bomber force was a different instrument from the one that had bled in early 1943. The 8th Air Force flew more than 2,000 bomber sorties in support of the invasion. Losses came from flak and fighters and accidents, but their scale was nothing like the worst months of the previous year. The fortress had become what its name suggested. The human side can be measured in tours completed. In early 1943, finishing 25 missions felt like a coin toss with death. By mid-1944, the standard tour length rose to 35 missions. Crews still died. No one in a bomber ever had it easy. But survival odds improved markedly. Veterans later said a simple thing. The G model gave us room to fight. In the summer and autumn of 1944, Germany launched its jets. The Me-262 streaked through formations with staggering speed. Even so, waist gunners in B-17G aircraft put holes in them. They did it by keeping calm arcs and smooth handoffs in the beam. Traditional machine guns were not the ideal weapon against jets, yet discipline and better stations kept the jets cautious. On Christmas Eve of 1944, the 8th Air Force flew the largest strike of the war to that date. Thousands of bombers filled the air over western Germany. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the stream, including jets and rocket-firing fighters. Losses, in proportion to the size of the operation, remained far lower than raids of early 1943. On February 3, 1945, nearly 1,000 B-17 aircraft attacked Berlin in daylight. 21 never came back. In 1943, that number would have been unthinkably low for such a raid. Production did not slow until victory was in sight. At peak, Boeing's Plant 2 employed tens of thousands of workers and turned out more than a dozen B-17G aircraft every day. The last one rolled off the line in April of 1945. The final combat mission for the 8th Air Force in Europe came near the end of that month. B-17G crews returned without loss. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey studied cause and effect. It found that the evolution of the B-17's defensive positions, particularly the staggered waist windows and enclosed mounts, materially improved survivability. The report noted something else. These changes did not require a new airplane. They required listening to crews, testing ideas, and pushing modifications through a vast industrial network at high speed. Dollars invested in those modifications saved aircraft and, more importantly, trained crews who could not be replaced quickly. The lessons spread. Late-model B-24 Liberators adopted staggered waist positions with enclosed mounts. The B-29 Superfortress moved to remote-controlled turrets that removed gunners from the slipstream entirely. Human factors became a formal part of aircraft design. Workspace, field of fire, glove clearance, hose routing, interphone cable length, insulation, and ice protection were no longer afterthoughts. They were requirements. Ask veterans, and they will tell you in plain language. The staggered waist windows saved lives. Gunners who had flown both F and G models described the difference as night and day. No more stumbling into your buddy in a turn. No more torn oxygen lines when the pilot threw the airplane into a skid. No more brass rolling under your boots while you tried to pivot. The gun stayed on target. The man stayed on oxygen. Today, a dozen B-17G aircraft still fly. Walk through one at a museum or an air show. Stand at the left waist, then step back to the right waist. You will feel the offset. You will see the enclosed clear panel and the mount that rotates smoothly under your hand. Guides will tell you how that small change came from bloody experience, how it moved from test stand to factory floor in weeks, and how it turned into thousands of airplanes within months. It is tempting to say the B-17G was designed in Seattle and Long Beach and Burbank. The truth is sharper. It was designed in combat. Crews wrote the rough drafts with grease pencil and frozen gloves. Engineers cleaned up the sentences. Factories pressed the pages. The staggered waist was one line in that story. The chin turret was another. The revised tail was a third. But the theme was constant. Learn fast. Build faster. Keep your people alive. Against an enemy that often fielded superb individual aircraft, the American edge was not a single weapon. It was a process. Find the failure. Fix it. Scale it. The waist of the bomber went from a liability to a strength because a gunner fell into his buddy one too many times, because a hose popped loose once too often, and because someone back home refused to accept that as the way it had to be. Simple ideas can change a war. Move the windows. Close the openings. Give each gunner a lane. That small act of engineering courage, multiplied by thousands of airplanes, helped unlock larger strategies. Deep strikes became possible. Fighter escorts could go hunting. German industry could be attacked again and again until it broke. The path to air superiority over Europe ran through decisions that seem obvious in hindsight, and were anything but obvious in the moment. The story ends with a quiet image. A B-17G sitting in a hardstand at dawn. Frost on the wings. Crew trucks parked nearby. A waist gunner checks his mount. He tugs his oxygen line. He fits his gloves. He looks at the window across from him and sees it is no longer across from him. He nods. The engines start. The formation takes to the sky. He will have space to fight today. He will have a better chance to come home.